question. How many people are you friends with who vote differently than you? If you do have friends of a different political persuasion, congratulations. You are not the norm. And if you're thinking, I don't really know if I have any friends who think differently than me on major issues like politics, well, don't worry, you're not alone. But actually, maybe you should worry just a little bit, because our nation is really polarized and it's getting more so. But there are things we can do about it, and that's what I want to talk about on the Know Why podcast today. I'm going to reference an article that's in the Free Press. I'll link it in the show notes that kind of inspired this topic for me this week. It's titled, "You Don't Need the Same Politics to Surf Together" by David Litt. It's all about how David, the author, is a Democrat who used to work for President Obama in Washington, D.C., and he married a woman whose brother was a truck driving, Joe Rogan listening, Trump voting, vaccine skeptic. And he thought, okay, I'm never going to have anything in common with my brother-in-law. And then they started surfing together and actually became really close and are really great friends. And David Litt actually wrote a book about it. So anyway, I'm going to talk about his article a bit, but this is actually something that has been going on for a long time. And my guess is that you've sensed that. You've sensed that we are very polarized as a nation, that we are very divided, and that maybe even within your lifetime, it has become harder to be friends with or socialize with or even imagine being close with somebody who holds the opposite political viewpoint that you do. So let's just look at a study from last fall, right before the presidential election of 2024, that found half of voters think the opposing party is downright evil. So not just wrong on their political opinions, but actually evil. And the truth is, it's been this way for a while. I remember writing an article back in 2017, so almost a decade ago, on a poll that came out that was very similar, where both Democrats and Republicans viewed their political opponents as having no moral decency at all, as not even being moral people. And 2017, that was before the COVID pandemic, and we know how divisive things got then. So it's been trending downward for a long time. I'm going to cite a few statistics really quick that David Litt includes in his article. Okay, so in 1999, 38% of people in the U.S. lived in a congressional district politically mixed enough to be considered competitive. So there were enough, Democrats and Republicans or people who tended to vote that way where the district was actually competitive. It could go blue or red in any election, and that meant there was a lot of political diversity. But by 2024, that number was just 20%. 20% of people living in a district that was politically up for grabs, so to speak. So people are segregating according to politics. So a Harvard analysis actually found that even within neighborhoods, Americans spend increasing amounts of time with people who think like them. I know people who actually work with moving organizations that are solely focused on moving people to states that are actually more in line with their beliefs. And part of me understands that because, a lot of these issues affect very basic elements of our lives, like where our kids are going to school and what they're being taught in school. And again, I think the COVID pandemic heightened this a lot because people felt very strongly about their beliefs in that time because it affected our daily lives. You either thought that my freedom is being stripped away because all of a sudden I'm being told I can't, go anywhere or do anything, and my, individual constitutional rights are being violated, or you're thinking it's not safe and people aren't caring about the health of people who are compromised or maybe elderly or younger. And so I feel like, I can't even be around people who aren't going to respect my health, and I don't want to rehash the whole COVID debate. You remember it. But it's no surprise, in other words, that people are tending to segregate even more to try to be in locations where they're going to be surrounded by people who think like them. Why is this happening though? Like we're seeing this happen more and more. We're seeing it become a trend. And as the author of this article writes, America has become a land of bubbles. So there are a few reasons for this, and I'm not a research expert or a sociologist or anything like this, but I have read about this topic for a long time. And so I'm just going to summarize a few of the points, both in this article from the Free Press and that I've observed over the last few years of reading on this issue, that I think will help us understand how we got to this polarized moment in American history, and then why it's a problem and what we can do about it. So one thing is institutions. So places like church and communities where people came together on a regular basis and they had a shared sense of trust in those institutions. And we also know from polling that trust in major traditional institutions has crumbled a lot in the last few decades. And this is happening on both the left and the right. But we are missing, especially when it comes to more community institutions like houses of worship, we're missing an area of congregation, an area that brought people together. And in those places, there was a unifier there, and that was a common set of maybe doctrinal beliefs or theological beliefs, but it brought people from a wide, variety, a wide array of backgrounds to one place, where the only thing that mattered was what they shared at that moment. And I think that's part of the beauty of places like houses of worship that we miss. And we know that, a few years ago, Gallup reported that for the first time in American history, fewer people belonged to a church or house of worship than actually regularly attended. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, that trend might be starting to reverse, but that left a big gap just purely socially, not even getting into the spiritual and religious implications of that, because people lost a major gathering point in their community that kept them tethered to their neighbors in a very real and practical way. You can, learn a lot about somebody and how to live in community with a diverse group of people when week after week you're sharing potlucks and prayer requests and worship time, and helping to watch each other's kids in nursery and everything with somebody who sits beside you in the pew who, maybe they vote differently than you, but when you're at church, it doesn't matter. But even other things like watching the news, okay? Used to, there were a few news channels and generally they were trusted. Now, as we've talked about again on the No I podcast a lot, everybody can get their own source of news and information, even completely different sets of facts. And algorithms that we use on social media, or that use us really on social media, pull us in different directions and help us to get even deeper into our ideological bubbles, so that we don't even have the same source of news and facts and information about what's happening in the world. Even those are disputed. And so another thing is we're really not as rooted to communities anymore. So people are a lot more mobile now, and there are a lot of benefits of this because of the popularity of things like remote work. People can live anywhere, but we often were told in our generations, and I'm talking about millennials and Gen Z, even kind of the metaphors that we use to describe somebody who is really successful or really smart or seen as having a lot of potential. It was like, wow, you'll go far, you're going places. Staying within a community was never really encouraged. On the one hand, you have people traveling oftentimes to these big metropolitan areas where the opportunities supposedly are, and those tend to lean one way ideologically, and so that can kind of reinforce the bubble. But you're also, again, being taken out of a real physical and even those smaller, more intimate community that rooted you to other people in a way that living in a city with millions of people or more is just not capable of doing. So those are some of the reasons why I think we find ourselves at the place that we do today. It's just there are multiple factors that have played into us becoming more and more separated from each other and less likely to run in the same circles as people who might think differently than we do. And a lot of that is by choice, but I think that other sociological factors, like the loss of trust in institutions, like the decline in church attendance and more mobility in society and moving and having more freedom to choose your own community. While some of those things are good, they've resulted in a lack of rootedness and more siloing, according to our political beliefs or our ideologies. So why is this a problem, though? Maybe you think, well, it's more comfortable to be around people that hold the same beliefs that I do. Maybe it even feels more safe. And if what I am seeing on the news is accurate, then I don't really want to be friends with people who are doing that or believing that anyway. Why does it matter if I have friends who hold different political opinions than I do? And so that's what I want to focus on for the next few minutes, is why that matters. Let me quote David again, the author of this article that I've been quoting from a bit. He says, "At a moment when our divides run deeper than ever, embrace the possibility of friendships that bridge them, not just because it might help heal the country or save democracy, but because it's a better way to live." And when you go and read his article, which I encourage you to do, you'll see that there are so many rich experiences just in life and travel and friendship that he and his brother-in-law would have missed out on if they had not decided to become friends and actually do this activity together and share this hobby together. And so they actually grew in experiences and had a whole new friendship open up that they never would have had if they hadn't been willing to cross that ideological bridge and hang out with somebody that thought differently than they did. But let's add a few more reasons to this. One, the loneliness epidemic. You know that there's a loneliness epidemic, and you think, well, maybe it's actually good that people are surrounding themselves with more like-minded friends. If we are becoming a little more siloed or a little more segregated ideologically, that could actually make people feel more at home, more like they belong. Well, that's a nice theory, but that's just not how it's working out. Because instead, you are seeing trends, and we talked about this last fall, about how you're seeing trends of people actually cut off longtime friends or even relatives, refusing to go to holiday dinners together and spend those times with loved ones because of politics, because of who they voted for. I'm sure we've all seen that post on Facebook or X or maybe Instagram. Go ahead and unfollow me now if you don't agree with X, Y, and Z, or I'm unfollowing everybody who I see post this. So even on social media, people are just cutting off any opinion that they don't want to see. And here's something really interesting. I actually didn't know about it until I heard about it in a point of view commentary from co-host Penna Dexter. So around the nation, more and more college students are using something called a no contact order. So it was originally developed to protect students who are victims of assault and harassment and things like that. But it's now being used for things like, friendship disputes and relationship issues and roommate disputes. And so it's interesting because a generation that has grown up with being able to block people online is increasingly blocking people in real life, saying you can't contact me in person on college campuses. So that's kind of a side note, but I think it's interesting because rather than building stronger connections and relationships and really meaningful connection with people who maybe, do share their beliefs, people are cutting off others in their real life because they disagree with them, and they are turning more and more to online community. I know some people who won't even use the word online community because they say that community has to be embodied. And so if you want to hear that debate, then go back and listen to our episode on localism. But they're finding more like-minded people in these online spaces. They don't offer the same benefits that real physical flesh and blood community offers. And so another thing is, in these online communities, it actually drives people oftentimes further away from the real life people that they really need. Because again, as we've talked about, the algorithms silo us even farther. They separate us according to our biases and what we're kind of predisposed to, and lead us toward more and more extremes to where we're not even seeing the same reporting and the same facts about an issue. And so this is happening online. And then guess what though? Your online connections can't be there for you in the same way that somebody who has actually known you for a long time and loves you, maybe they don't vote the same way that you do, but the grandma that's always loved you, or the longtime friend or relative who cares about you and lives locally, but you think their politics are crazy. There's somebody that, as long as they're a decent person, will actually bring you a meal when you're sick, or be willing to talk to you if you're struggling with something, be there for you in a time of crisis. And so people are losing those connections. And a lot of times, unfortunately, it's by choice. So here's another thing that I threw in there, a reason I think we should be friends with more people who think differently than we do. It's more interesting. It makes you a more interesting person. It sharpens your own beliefs and your intellect as well. Okay, so you and a like-minded friend rant back and forth about some political thing, or, your political opponents or whatever. And really, what does that do? You're just repeating the same thing back and forth to each other. But try talking with somebody that you disagree with about something. You're going to get a new perspective. Maybe some of these, stereotypes that you've believed about that other person or that other position, maybe those will be challenged. And even if you don't change your position, and doesn't mean you have to do that, even if you don't change your mind, hearing somebody else's argument, and actually understanding their perspective and getting to articulate your own beliefs and practicing that, it's going to make your own beliefs stronger in the long run. And so there's actually something really healthy about having the space where, without getting mean and personal, you can just intellectually go back and forth and kind of wrestle through an issue with somebody who has a different perspective than you. It's iron sharpening iron. And that's one of the things that makes this nation so great. That's how our founding documents came into being. And imperfect as the founding was, it gave us the tools to be able to continue to improve and work toward the freedom that was promised in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. And we think of the founding fathers as a monolith, but actually they had a lot of disagreements. And so those early days were arguments and debates and going back and forth. And that is where so many of the good ideas that we still benefit from today emerged. So it's actually, it makes you a better person and a more interesting person and a smarter person, I think, to regularly talk with somebody who maybe has a different belief than you do. So I want to go on a deeper level too, though. Of course, as a Christian, I think that there's always a spiritual truth at the root of these big issues that we discuss. So let's talk about something that's found in the book of Luke in chapter 6. I'm going to read a few verses, and I like to read from a physical book because everything's on the computer now. But this is starting in Luke chapter 6, verse 32. If you love only the people who love you, what praise should you get? Even sinners love the people who love them. If you do good only to those who do good to you, what praise should you get? Even sinners do that. If you lend things to people, always hoping to get something back, what praise should you get? Even sinners lend to other sinners so that they can get back the same amount. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without hoping to get anything back. Then you will have a great reward, and you will be children of the Most High God, because He is kind even to people who are ungrateful and full of sin. Show mercy just as your Father shows mercy. So, if you do want to break it down into a more foundational level, we're not supposed to just get along with the people who get along with us. There is nothing special about that. And maybe even if you're not a Christian, you might be able to recognize that there is something different about somebody who is willing to go the extra mile for somebody that they disagree with. Somebody that they might consider an enemy, somebody who extends mercy when, you would understand if they didn't. And that's what we're called to do. And imagine if more people were willing to live like that. So let's move on to the last part of this. If this intrigues you, if you feel like, okay, I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, what can I do about this? Well, the first thing is, even before you get out and start socializing with people of the, opposite political persuasion, we can just work on our own minds, work on renewing your own mind. And that starts with figuring out where you may be having some, inaccurate assumptions about people, or maybe believing some stereotypes and assuming the worst of your political opponents. Okay, you may be like, I just don't get why they vote this way, or why they back that, or why they're saying that. Well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to try. I don't want you to agree with it if it, opposes your own deeply held beliefs, but just do a thought exercise where you at least try to understand a few reasons, even if you think they're misguided or uneducated, but a few legitimate reasons why somebody might support a position that you oppose. And just think, again, you can still think that it's wrong, but just figure out if you can imagine a few reasons why. And this kind of also goes in with like imagination and curiosity, right? I think replacing so many of our knee-jerk reactions and emotions to things with curiosity will also kind of cool the political climate. Instead of saying, I can't believe that they think that way, say, I wonder why they think that way. Let me use my imagination and try to figure out, okay, what could have led them to hold that position or believe that that's the right thing to do. Maybe I still don't agree, but at least I think I understand a little bit better. Okay. And part of that is not generalizing. Don't say Democrats always or all Republicans, because people are unique individuals. You probably don't like it when people assume things about you, or just lump you in with a group and assume things about your thoughts and feelings and beliefs. And so don't do that to other people. Realize that everybody is unique and an individual, and they might not think exactly the way you think they do. So in a previous No Why podcast episode, as part of our political engagement series last year, we interviewed Chris Butler. He's an executive leader at the AND campaign, and they are really doing a lot of work on this issue in particular to realize that people can come together even from different political backgrounds and get a lot of stuff done. And so they really do promote a civil approach to civic engagement. So I recommend checking out some of their resources on that. But one of the things that Chris Butler challenged listeners to do is list 10 things that your own party is getting wrong. So if you can't do that, he says you might have been brainwashed. So I'll leave it there. I'll link that episode too, because it has a lot of really good resources, but just think about that. Okay, so here's a big one. Don't avoid interaction with people that you disagree with. So to quote David Lidigan, the author of this Free Press article, when you don't interact with people, it's easy to believe the worst about them. It's much harder to demonize a group when that group includes a friend. So again, you can start by saying, I'm not going to generalize. I'm not going to demonize a whole group. I'm going to realize that people are individuals. That is going to be so much more real to you when you actually are interacting with an individual who holds a different belief than you. And then it's a lot harder to generalize or to make these blanket negative statements because there's somebody that you care about and that you actually know. So again, to bring it back to a foundational truth or a spiritual truth at the root of this, we got to think about how we define people. And so if we define people by their beliefs, their voting habits, or even their behavior, then it's easier to just completely write them off when they believe something that we think is wrong, when they vote a way that we disagree with, or when they act in such a way that we disagree with. To just say, okay, doesn't matter, not worth my time, not worth me having a relationship at all. But if you recognize that every person is actually created with love, a bearer of the image of God, meaning that they are reflecting parts of God's nature just in the fact that they exist as a human being, and that there's somebody that God loves. And if you are a Christian, you believe that there's somebody that Jesus died for, then it's harder to write them off. And you can't just say, well, I'm not ever going to interact with them. All of a sudden, we actually have a mandate to interact with them, political views notwithstanding. So if you want to think about this more and implement some of these things in your life, which I hope you do, and we can all improve on this, right? I mean, yeah, it's easier and more comfortable sometimes to just hang with people that are like-minded. And that's not a bad thing, but we shouldn't completely cut ourselves off to people who we disagree with. And we can actually have a lot of benefit from being with those people. Something else that I wanted to mention earlier, I talked about how I wrote on this topic back in 2017. So the hook for that article was the fact that a congressional representative, Steve Scalise, had actually been shot at a baseball practice for the congressional baseball game that happens every year between Democrats and Republicans. So a Republican representative was shot by deranged Democratic voter. And this is another problem that we're seeing, and why this matters is that we are seeing political violence. We've seen attacks against Republicans, attacks against law enforcement officers. We've seen attacks against Democratic politicians, anti-Semitic attacks. So, assassination attempts during the campaign last year. So political violence is a problem across the spectrum. And so after this particular shooting, you saw kind of a rare moment of Democrats and Republicans in Congress coming together. And one of the things that they did was publicly talk about how the Democrats were going to host a banquet for Republicans, their Republican colleagues, and they were all going to work on really humanizing each other and coming together as colleagues more often and just engaging in that way, sharing a meal, sharing conversations, connecting over things like, their sports and their spouses and their kids, and things that we can all relate to. One of the representatives said, when the leadership of this country is civil towards one another, maybe the public will start being civil towards one another too. Unfortunately, we can't leave it up to our leaders. I would like to see leaders do a better job of this. Often there's rhetoric from both sides, and really that's to try to, scrounge up support among the voter base so that they can win the next election. And so they will use very hyperbolic and very apocalyptic and divisive rhetoric over issues, and that's not helpful. You do see some examples of civility and camaraderie among political leaders, but not often. And we can't wait for them to set the example. So this really, I think, has to be a grassroots level effort of changing the culture on this and reclaiming community and saying that we're not going to allow ourselves and our nation and our society to become so polarized. So I think it has to start with us. I don't think we can wait on political leaders to do this. And I don't think, honestly, it's in their interest to do this because they have to get people out to the polls to vote, not by really discussing, all the merits of some boring legislation that's going to affect things in the long run, but by really repeating the message that your political opponent, this opposite party, they are the enemy and America is going to be over if they win. And it's in their interest to do that because that's how they get people to support them. That's how they get people to vote. Fear moves people. Fear mongering gets people to the polls. Having a civil debate or, intellectual conversation about an issue and, being civil and polite with somebody, even though you might vigorously disagree with them on something, that doesn't get a whole lot of viewers. That doesn't really motivate people to go vote, and unfortunately. So it really does have to be a grassroots issue of promoting civility and community among ourselves. We can't wait on political leaders to do that. So anyways, back to resources. I'll link all of these in the description in the show notes, but I just want to mention them here too. Of course, the Free Press article that I have cited multiple times, You Don't Need the Same Politics to Surf Together by David Litt. And as he mentions, he has a book out on this issue. And so definitely follow that, read his article. It's got some great stuff. The Know Why podcast episode that I mentioned How can I keep faith above partisanship? That was the title of the episode where I interviewed Chris Butler. And that episode also has a lot of great resources linked in it. So you can find that at knowwhypodcast.com. And then another book, if you want to read a book or listen to a book on this, was by former Senator Ben Sasse. It's called Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. It came out a few years ago. And again, it's just has some really good insight on how we got to this polarized place. And he really does a good job at looking at some of those institutions and kind of community level cohesion that has fallen apart and brought us to where we are today. That's my thought. So I challenge you to implement some of these changes and check out some of these additional resources. And I'll see you next week on the Know Why Podcast.